Thanks very much for inviting me on. I'm in illustrious company. I know. I watched the interview with Tony Forder last night. But my name's Julie Anderson, and my first crime thriller called Plague was published in September of this year. It's the first in a series with my central protagonist, Cassandra Fortune, who is a civil servant, but also an investigator whose background was in GCHQ. And when we meet Cassie, she's moved from there. Something murky happened in the past. We don't quite know what. And she's working in what she regards as a very dead-end job in Whitehall. She gets caught up in an adventure because she's sent to a construction site because there's delay in developing a London Underground line, and discovers a body in an old plague pit, and that's when the adventure starts. Now, this is the first in a series, as I said. The second one is called Oracle. It's due out in spring. And the third is called Opera. And I'm not even thinking about that yet. Well, I am a little bit. That's the book, really.
You've got a giveaway going as well, haven't you?
I have. Thank you for prompting me. Yes, at the moment, I'm giving away 12 signed copies of Plague. You can see them behind me, to people who have suggested they have an interest, and lots of people have, which is great. But the time limit for that is close of play tomorrow. So there's just over 24 hours before I stop adding people to the list, and then I can put the names in the hat and draw out the winners. So thank you for mentioning that.
No problem. When you set out to start writing Plague, did you always know it was going to be a series?
I had a good idea because my publisher, it was my publisher who prompted me, first of all, to get into writing crime fiction. And one of the things that they wanted was a character that could see more than one book. I wasn't completely convinced initially that I was a crime writer at all, because my previous books had been historical adventure stories. But I was buttonholed by Katie from Claret Press at the Clapham Book Festival, which I helped to run. It's an annual book festival in South London. And she was very persuasive and said, you know, your adventure stories have got jeopardy and danger and intrigue and mystery, and, you know, you can write all those things. So you should be able to write a crime thriller. And so I was persuaded into it, and I knew from the outset that they wanted me to write something that had a central character who could go on into other books. But it was and is my first crime book, so I wasn't entirely sure what I was doing, and I couldn't be absolutely certain that would be the case.
So, what are the differences between writing historical adventures and crime novels?
Well, the subject matter, I guess. I mean, I'll show you. I've got my. This is the first historical adventure story that I wrote. It's called Reconquista, and it's set in 13th century Al-Andalus, which is the Andalusia region of Spain. And I can tell you that writing adventure stories set in the 13th century Al-Andalus is a niche occupation. And there's a second one, and I'll get this in too. There you go. This is the Silver Rings, and it was that was the sequel to Reconquista. I mean, they didn't sell hugely well, because they were fairly niche. Although the people who read them liked them, and there was word of mouth, but there wasn't any big take up. Although in fact, Reconquista was longlisted for the best children's novel of 2016, of which I am inordinately proud. But that didn't do an awful lot by way of helping sales. I guess that a lot of the structure of the books is similar to a crime story in that they are set in wartime, at the time of the Moorish occupation of Andalus and the Christian invasion, and so there's lots of danger and peril, and there's a quest involved. And of course, there's a quest involved in all crime fiction, the quest usually being to discover who did it. Although sometimes, of course, you know who did it, and it's to discover why that person did it, or whether the cops or the investigators or the PI or whatever will catch them. So there is quite a lot of crossover, but there's, I mean, things like the historical research you would have thought wouldn't translate necessarily into crime stories, but unfortunately they did in Plague, because I can't help writing about history, I guess. And there's quite a lot of historical stuff in Plague. Does that answer the question?
It does. I was going to ask you about the historical elements in Plague and why you chose to call it Plague.
Well, it was called Plague from the outset, and I started writing it in 2018. And that's something I've had to say a lot, many times, because people think that it's to do with COVID, and it's not. As you know, you've read it. It's not a COVID novel. It's not even a pandemic novel. I mean, the plague is a metaphor in the title, and it was always called that because the plague in that book is the plague of power, the contagion of power and the powerful. It was a bit of a risk to continue with it once we had COVID, because it could be misconstrued as a sort of clickbait type title, just to get people interested. But that's not what it was. I mean, it was there long before COVID came along. But I did sit down with the publisher, and we did consider whether it should still be called Plague, given the circumstances. And we decided that it should be, because at the time, we didn't know how long. As you know, there are months before a book is actually published, that it's actually created by the printer and so on. And we didn't know back in sort of March, April, whether COVID would still be around by September when the book was slated to be published. So we just left it as it was. And in some ways, that's actually been advantageous in that people think it has a modern relevance, which I hope it does, but not for the reasons that they think. And it's got quite a lot of publicity, but it also has involved me having to explain an awful lot about the fact that it isn't a COVID novel and it's not about a pandemic.
Do you want to tell us a bit about the subterranean aspects?
Subterranean aspects. Oh, right. Well, I worked in Whitehall for many years. I was a senior civil servant, and Whitehall and Westminster. So it's an area I know very well, and it's fascinating. It's a fascinating place to work because there is so much history and so many layers of history on top of the other. And necessarily this means sort of subterranean history, if you like, because the older buildings always go down much lower. So you have places of work which have been at the center of power for centuries in effect, because Thorney Island was created where the old River Tyburn met the River Thames and created this island on which what became Westminster Abbey was founded, and subsequently the Palace of Westminster, which was a royal residence before it became the Houses of Parliament. And so there's all this history sort of stacking up in layers there. And the Tyburn, still exists. It runs as part of Joseph Bazalgette's sewerage system across London. But you also have aspects of, for example, World War II history underneath the buildings where I worked. there is what was always referred to by civil servants as the hole in the ground, which was Churchill's war rooms. Now, part of that is open to the public now as the Cabinet Office war rooms, but in fact, it's much, much bigger than that particular area, and it goes as far down as the Horseferry Road, where this whole network of subterranean offices, where during World War II, because of the bombing, people would be working, tracking aircraft coming in, bombing raids, tracking casualties, and so on, and large numbers of members of the government sort of taking shelter there. So there's that aspect as well. So you have everything from sort of 5th and 6th century rivers through to sort of Victorian sewers, medieval parts of the Palace of Westminster, like the Jewel Tower, which is much lower than the other buildings around it if you go and see it. And also this sort of World War II aspect of the offices that are beneath Whitehall. I am going to be doing a talk on subterranean London, and you gave me the wonderful intro there, Caroline, into that on the 11th of December. It's free. It's you can see the details of it on Eventbrite, and I'm going to be talking with Dr. Thomas Ardhill, who's curator of the Museum of London, who in 2019 curated a wonderful exhibition called Secret Rivers. I don't know whether any of the people viewing this went to see it, but it charts all the secret rivers that still flow beneath London, usually now as part of the sewage system, but not exclusively. Sometimes they still come into daylight, so they feed into various ponds, for example, in the Serpentine, for example, in Hyde Park, or the lakes in St James's Park, that they have, and Regent's Park too. There is, I am told, and I want to ask Tom about this when we're having our discussion, a Tyburn Salmon Fishing Society. Now, I don't think there are any salmon in the River Tyburn anymore, because the Tyburn is mostly underground and part of sewers. But apparently this club exists, and it wants to bring back salmon to the River Tyburn. So there's quite a lot of subterranean London in play, as you know.
Did your knowledge of the rivers, did your knowledge of Whitehall help you with your planning of the book?
What? Well, oh, I say, I've just lost Caroline. Should I keep going?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, it did. I mean, I'm writing about a place that I know. I worked there for 27, 30 years, and so it helps in that when I place my protagonist walking down Whitehall towards the Houses of Parliament, I know what's there all around her, and I know the little things like there was a lovely sort of sandwich shop and cafe, now gone, I have to say, but on Whitehall, where everybody used to go and get coffee, and occasionally you'd sort of sit down and have your own meetings, sort of one-to-one meetings sat in the back of the cafe, and things like that. So it adds, I suppose, I hope anyway, it adds some authenticity to the novel. And likewise, things like knowing about how the Palace of Westminster works, and the doorkeepers there who wander around in their wonderful antique uniforms, keeping a watch on everyone, and interesting little facts like the fact that although Parliament makes the laws, it's not subject to them. It is in that sense above the law. And although the law is applied in Parliament, it's done in a very unusual manner. It's not like the rest of the UK. And when the Scottish and the Welsh administrations, the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, were being devolved, back in the late 90s. It was interesting that the civil servants who were asked to draw up the legislation that created those bodies were asked specifically to avoid the situation that existed and still exists in Westminster, where in effect the law doesn't apply. Does that answer your question? How hard is it to weave threads through a novel? Oh, hello, Samantha. You've taken over. We'll keep going. Well, I suppose it's not particularly easy, or everyone would do it, but it's something you have to plan for, I think, especially if you want to include an element of surprise or tension or jeopardy, because you have to have a number of different threads going in a story in order to switch between them. And also character development. You can't just focus on one thing. You have to have lots of different things happening. Aha! You are returned. I've managed to keep going. I hope that's all right. Samantha helped too.
You did marvelously. I'm back.
Okay.
Samantha, it was marvelous, wasn't she? She was just coming in. I can see her on the bottom of the screen where she was going to come in and help out because I couldn't get myself back. She also asked you what it was like being involved in the Clapham Book Festival.
Oh, that's a great fun. That was set up about 5 or 6 years ago by me and a number of other writers who live in Clapham, because we thought, well, look, there are lots of writers here. Let's have a book festival. Sort of. I mean, it was a bit more complicated than that, but that was sort of where it came from. And we didn't have it this year, obviously. Just like everything else, it was abandoned. And indeed, the committee only met last week to discuss Clapham Book Fest 2021, which is going ahead. We're not entirely sure what form it's going to take, whether it's going to be physical. We want to do some physical stuff because it's the Clapham Book Festival, so we want it to happen in Clapham. And lots of people would come along to it, and local people. So we want some physical events, but we also want to do some online events too, because one of the things that we've realised is it is actually very easy to do things like this, and we just hope that people haven't been zoomed out, and want to take part. But we want to do some interesting things, like do a literary walk, for example. I'm very into walks. Indeed, the UK Crime Book Club has helped me with one walk. I did a book walk along the route of the Tyburn for Plague, for publicity purposes, though I've subsequently been contacted by a man from the London Walks Company who wants me to do a real one, a guided walk, and I've done a leaflet of what that walk might look like. So thank you. I've got to say thank you to Phoebe, Patricia, Emma, and hold on, I wrote this down before. Phoebe, Patricia, Pam, and Emma, who have volunteered to test out the leaflet and do the walk, make sure it all works. I mean, obviously not right now because we can't, but at some point they'll test it out and see whether it works. And I got them through this website group, so that's this group. That was very good.
Are you tempted to share photos of the locations in the book? Because they're quite unusual, some of them.
Sorry, can you say that again?
Are you tempted to share photos of the locations in the book?
Yeah, I did some of them. I did some photo montages on my website and on my Facebook and Twitter feeds, actually showing the different places, because it's so historic, the setting, and some of them are just so interesting, quite frankly, that's why the book was sort of inspired, or the book walk was inspired, because it's a lovely walk through London. You start at Bond Street Station and then walk through Mayfair, over Green Park, to Buckingham Palace, and then across St James's Park, which is just lovely, and then through the lovely old Georgian streets beyond Birdcage Walk and down to Whitehall, Horse Guards Parade, and Westminster Square, and it's just a lovely walk. So if people want to see that, go onto my website, which is julieandersonwriter.com, and there are lots of photographs up there and blogs about the walk.
Emma said that she's looking forward to doing the walk.
Good.
Good. Sandra Ray says, is your Clapham Book Festival a crime event, or is it like a multi-genre?
It's multi-genre. We usually have at least one crime panel because crime is so popular. And we were going to have this year and probably will next year. But it's multi-genre because it's essentially what people are interested in, or what we can pull together that we think will interest people. So we've done sessions on crime, but also historical fiction, also spy fiction, and we usually have some headline speakers who are quite well known for other things. So we had Frank Gardner recently. If you saw the documentary on BBC Two, Being Frank, which was up there, which was on TV a 4 weeks ago, you will see him at the Clapham Book Festival because they filmed him when he was there. And we've also had, it's partly because, of course, the BBC is in London, so lots of people who work in the BBC are around here. We've had Kate Adie, who came to talk to us in the evening at the Book Fest. She had a book out on the role of women in World War One. And she was talking about that, but also about her experience in Tiananmen Square and in the desert and so on. So it's a whole raft of different things, not just crime.
Do you host the panels and events?
I do. I'm a host. I sit there and have my questions ready in case people have when the conversation dries up. I have to say that that's never happened to me, and often the difficulty is actually stopping people. Because once you get the sort of to and fro between panelists, and they're interested in what they're talking about. I mean, on a number of occasions, the audience has had to leave the theatre because we've got to get the next audience in, and the panel still sat there chatting away at the front because it's interesting, and that's always really, really rewarding.
Do you have like favorite go-to questions as a host?
Oh, yes, I guess so. And I think that's, well, things like how do you do research for your books, for example? Do you go to experts, or do you do lots of reading, or all that side of things? That's usually a good one. But also, how do you create your characters? Are they based on people you know? I've done this before, you see. I'm sure you know all these. I'm sure you've got all these as well.
I'm laughing because off screen, when I asked you that question, Samantha asked one of our favourites, which is what has been your most memorable moments as an author so far.
Oh, right. Right. I think I saw that this question was asked regularly in these interviews, so I did think about this, and I was trying to come up with one example, and I couldn't. And that's because I think it's happening now, because Plague is my first crime novel, and I hadn't realised, although I love detective fiction and always have. As a child growing up, from Conan Doyle all the way through James Ellroy and the wonderful Raymond Chandler and right up to Val McDermid and sort of modern day. But I hadn't realised quite how much of a rabbit hole I was going down when I started to be a crime writer. and there were, you know, so many groups and so many people who really enjoyed it, and great people as well. So I'm just enjoying it now. I'm enjoying doing this. I'm enjoying doing the discussion that we've got planned about subterranean secrets of London, and doing the book walk and engaging with people about crime novels. Because you know, that sort of impetus didn't exist when I was writing about 13th century Spain, for example, which was definitely a sort of niche market. Does that answer the question, Samantha?
Yeah, it definitely does. She's nodding off screen. She also says you have a direction in mind for further crime books, for example, always with a huge theme like plague. Where's Oracle going to go next?
Oh, well, Oracle goes off to Greece. You've read Plague, so you know that Oracle goes off to Greece, because Cassie has a mission to perform near Delphi on Mount Parnassus, and there's a sort of story attaching to that, because many years ago, there is near Delphi, there is something called the European Cultural Centre, which is this very modern and beautifully designed cultural centre. And that hosts conferences and so on. And many years ago, 20 years ago now, I went to a conference at that centre, and we got a tour of the temple site, which is glorious. If you've never been to Delphi, do think about going, because it's stunningly beautiful. But it was in November, and it was halfway up a very big mountain. And when there was a huge storm, and the weather deteriorated rapidly, and we were the conference attendees were sat there in the dining room, and you know, the lights were flickering, and you know, the wind was whistling outside, and somebody said this would be a great place for a murder. So when I created Cassie, I thought, where can I send her next? Where would be a really good place for a murder? So that's where she's going.
Is she going to have a new sidekick? Because
yes, you can't say that. You mustn't say anything. But yes, she does. She's on her own in the next one, though she is sent an interpreter from the embassy, because she doesn't speak Greek. So she does have someone, an assistant, to help her. But she's very much on her own in this book, and she has to do some learning about herself. And Delphi's a good place to do that, because it's most famous for its maxim, know thyself. The temple of Apollo, the god admonishes people to know themselves. So she goes off to Delphi in the next one, and then Opera, which is the next one, she comes back to London, and has to resolve some issues, as they say.
Mike Craven says hello. And Samantha wants to know, do you wander around looking for places to hide future bodies?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Samantha wants to know, do you wander around looking for places to hide future bodies? Purposes, of course.
Well, sort of. I don't like to say yes, because you know, my friends will start looking at me from the side of their eyes and thinking, what is she looking at now? But yes, you do. I mean, you can't help it. You sort of think, oh yes, that would be that would be interesting. And given that so much of Plague takes place underground, and so much of London has that sort of underground feel to it, then you know, and so much history, and it's just so interesting that you can't walk through London without thinking of places where you might find bodies. And also there are ancient temples in Greece where you could do the same.
My mum is watching with me, so I'm going to just say happy birthday, Mum, for tomorrow.
Oh, happy birthday to your mum. I thought it was last week.
No, it's this week.
Oh, right. Okay.
Tomorrow is her birthday.
Oh, well, happy birthday, Caroline's mum. Have a lovely time.
Do you I'm trying to think of how to word this as well. So Are there topics that you wouldn't write about? Because there's some quite dark moments in Plague.
Yes, there are. Yes, there are. I mean, it isn't graphic, the description of violence, but there is undoubtedly violence and sort of evil intent. So it is quite dark in some aspects. Is there anything I wouldn't write about? I suspect the answer to that is no. I think you can write about anything, but I think it depends on the way that you write about it. I mean, I would find some topics horrendously difficult to write about, like child murder, for example, or the very worst kinds of people trafficking and exploitation. I used to work in the Commission for Equality and Human Rights, and we did a lot of work on modern day slavery, and some of that was extremely harrowing to work on. But I don't think you shouldn't write about it. I think you can write about it you can write about anything, but you have to be careful how you write about it. I think that answers the question.
It does. Sandra Ray says she's just downloaded Plague.
Sorry?
Sandra Ray says she's just downloaded Plague.
Oh, right. Well, I hope she enjoys it. And she must let me know. She must write a review and let me know what she thinks of it. I before, just for the audience, before we started, Caroline and I were discussing her review of Plague, because she didn't like the fact that my central character, who seemed a very intelligent and smart and with it lady, made some very poor choices near the end of the book. I think that's fair to say. It's quite difficult to talk about it without giving the plot away.
It is, yeah.
But as I was saying to Caroline, we all know extremely intelligent, clever, together people who are that way in, say, in their professional lives or with their friends or whatever, who do completely loopy things when it comes to love and relationships and sex and so on. You know, you can. I'm sure everyone can think of examples, and you think, you know, can't he see what's going on, that she's using him, etc., or why is she with him? You know, he'll only try and dominate her and control her and all this sort of stuff. So I think people make wrong choices all the time, unfortunately. And my heroine makes some absolute doozies.
We agree on that.
Yeah.
What was your process like of writing for Plague? Do you plot out in advance, or do you make up as you go?
To a degree, I plot out in advance. And in that, I find it. I mean, Samantha asked me earlier when we had the sort of little technological blip, how we wove threads of a story together, and I think that you can't. It's very difficult. I'm sure if you're vastly experienced, you can do this. You know, in your head. I can't. I have to actually write it down and plan out what the threads of my story are and how they weave together. And that doesn't just mean plot threads. It also means character threads and how characters change and grow. And it also means themes. So, I mean, the theme for Plague is power, as you know, but all kinds of power. So it's financial power. I mean, one of the major characters is a hedge fund manager. It's political power. It's centered on the Palace of Westminster and the House of Commons and the House of Lords. It's sexual power and emotional power. So and economic power. One of the victims is not a well-off person at all who has discovered he's going to become a father and resorts to crime because you know, he has no money. There are also, yes, I know I'm giving away the plot here. I can imagine my publisher is throwing things at the laptop even as we speak. But there's also a homeless man in Plague who helps the detectives because he's on the street and he sees things happening. So if you're going to keep all those threads together, for me, I have to plan it out. I'm sure that more experienced people can just do it in their heads, but I can't. At least I can't yet. I don't know whether I'll ever be able to.
So Mike Craven, who writes as M.W. Craven, he's asked, do you have to get permission to write about certain things? I think he's referring to your previous career in Whitehall, maybe?
Yes, I think he might be. Do I ordinarily, someone like me would have to get permission to write a book, either fiction or non-fiction, if I did it immediately after I left the civil service. But I left the civil service in 2012, so that's 8 years ago. And things will have changed. I mean, people say a week is a long time in politics. 8 years, whoa, a very long time. So in that sense, I'm sort of outside the clutches of the civil service, if you like. But I knew that I would have to be very careful about writing about security, for example, security in the Palace of Westminster, because it is a major terrorist target now, and always has been from Guy Fawkes onwards. So I had to be very careful about that, and I actually did get someone from the palace to read it to make sure that I wasn't giving anything away. And one of the people who helped me enormously, and who I acknowledge in the acknowledgements at the rear of the book, was a chap called Mike Narowinski, who was a former Deputy Sergeant at Arms of the Palace of Westminster. So he ran the place, in effect. And I had to check everything. I mean, he was lovely, and I knew him anyway. And he's at Pembroke College, Oxford now, and I went up to see him, and he read through everything to check, A, that I'd got it right, but B, that I wasn't actually giving anything away about security or how Westminster operates that would help someone who wanted to infiltrate it. Does that answer your question, Mr. Craven?
Hopefully it does. Have you been called on to be an expert? Have you ever been called on to be an expert for other authors with your knowledge of things like the civil service?
No. No, I'm quite happy to be if people want, but no. But then I guess that's because, I mean, up until now, I was writing about 13th century Spain. So it's only with plague that I've actually started setting my books in contemporary times and writing about things like Westminster and Whitehall and so on. And there are people who are whose knowledge is much more current than mine, to be absolutely honest. I mean, I've got quite a lot of knowledge. I worked there for nearly 30 years, but I don't have current knowledge. I'm very, very pleased not to have current knowledge, I have to say. I'm very glad I'm not in Whitehall now. But people will be up to date in a way that I'm not, who would probably be better in terms of being advisors to writers. Though if Mr. Craven wants anyone to talk to about Whitehall, I'm happy to do it.
You said you did answer his question.
Oh, did he?
Mm-hmm. He said yes when you said
okay.
Your question. What experts did you consult for your book? Did you talk to experts or?
I had Mike, who was the Deputy Sergeant at Arms of the Palace. I also spoke to Dr. Danielle. Oh dear, I've just forgotten her name. This is appalling. Forgive me. Dr. Danielle Carson, who is a scientist working on grade 3 pathogens. So she told me all about Yersinia pestis, which is the Black Death bacillus, and also helped me in terms of how it's unbelievable now, but how the National Health would respond to a plague threat, which, I mean, we know now, but at the time I had to do that research. Also, I had Ray Collins, who's Baron Collins of Highbury, who is currently the opposition spokesperson on international aid and development in the Lords, who was kind enough to read it for me to check up on all the House of Lords side of things. She said, looking down, just to remind myself, and Baroness Prosser, who I used to work with at the Commission for Equality and Human Rights, who is now chair of the Parliament and Industry Trust, who also read it for me, so that I've got some actual real parliamentarians who could make sure that I hadn't said anything that was, you know, wrong or inaccurate or so on. And Ray Collins told me he thought I captured the inside of the Palace of Westminster very well, especially how easy it was to get lost, because he said he's got lost on lots of occasions, which is interesting. But I also had a friend down in the West Country who's a retired police officer, who read it for me for things like make sure I got the police procedure correct. So yeah, I use lots of experts.
So the advantage of dealing with plague over COVID is that plague can be dealt with antibiotics?
It can now, yes, absolutely. I mean, it's still you still have outbreaks of it in the world, and it's now listed as a grade 2 pathogen, not a grade 3, because it's now treatable. I mean, the sort of thing that Danielle Carson deals with is, I mean, things like Ebola, for example, and SARS and MERS. So they're, you know, serious contagious diseases. Now, bubonic plague, Yersinia pestis, is still highly contagious, but it is treatable. So I know more about level 3 pathogens than I ever imagined I could possibly know. But not COVID, of course, because that wasn't around when I was writing it. But everybody knows about COVID then.
Would you write about COVID in another book?
I don't know. It's quite difficult, and I know that fellow authors have had this debate. Some of them, for example, Tom Watson, who was formerly the deputy leader of the Labour Party, has just had a book come out called The House, which he's co-written with Imogen Robertson, who I know, and Tom, who I've met anyway in my previous career. And that book does include references to people having to wear masks and the NHS and so on, because it's set now. And whilst my book was set contemporaneously, it doesn't have to be set in 2020. You know, you can slide it slightly back to 2019, and it doesn't actually say 2020 anywhere in the novel. It did originally, because I actually deliberately created it so that the dates aligned with the parliamentary timetable. So, as you know, you've read the book, that the clock is ticking because the House rises for party conferences in October, and Cassie and the police have to find out what's happening before that happens. And that was all aligned with the parliamentary timetable for 2020. Unfortunately, that went out the window with COVID. So all that clever organising was utterly pointless, completely nugatory work. But anyway.
So Samantha says, are you more comfortable when you're the interviewer or the interviewee?
Oh, I don't know. I actually don't know the answer to that question. I think I'm more used to being the interviewer, so I probably feel more comfortable because I'm familiar with that role, and to an extent, you're in control, because you know the people who you're working with will pick up cues from you. You know, so for example, if you're beginning to run out of time, or if you want to move to a different topic, you can do that, and people pick up on that and go with you, and so you have a degree of control. But then I guess also as an interviewee, you can say what you want. So I've seen enough politicians, as no doubt have you, to understand that you can be asked one question and give a completely different answer about something totally different. So I guess I just need to get used to it a bit more, maybe.
Yours was the second book I've read this year that's been set like partly in Whitehall.
Oh, really? What was the first one?
The other one was by Peter Hain, who wrote The Rhino Conspiracy.
Oh, right.
And
Okay,
I
no, I've
learned
not read that.
so much about politics from reading both of them.
Ah.
Because I had no idea about any of the information or what it was like inside Whitehall or anything like that.
Mm.
I read either of the books, so it's
Well,
quite.
you see, you'll be the expert next.
Yeah. Definitely been educational reading then. Samantha says, what do you think the most important elements of writing a great story are? Just keeping on your toes.
I think the idea, actually, the idea is the thing. In that you can have, there is a theory that says that, there are only about 6 plots. There's boy meets girl, rags to riches, Arms and the Man. They're very classic stories, and they go back to folk tales and Homer and myths and legends and so on. So I don't think it's plot, though plot is important, especially in crime, obviously. But I think it's and obviously character is important, and often character gives rise to plot because it's the characters that you create that behave in certain ways that drive some elements of the plot. But I think actually it's the idea behind the book which is important. So in this case, the idea was about power. In Oracle, for example, the theme, if you like, is justice, and I think that crime books, even that just bill themselves as whodunits or detective stories, still have ideas behind it. And most commonly in the crime genre, of course, it's justice seeking. And people say that people read crime books because they want to see justice done. They want the villain to be caught. They want it goes back to those old Saturday mornings in the cinema. The cowboys wearing the white hats and the cowboys wearing the black hats. I guess goodies and baddies and so on. And it gets incredibly complicated and far more sophisticated than that. And I don't want to belittle any kind of writing, including crime writing. But ultimately, it's the idea behind it, I think, which is important. I haven't expressed that very well.
I think you did a good explanation. What inspired the character of Cassie?
What?
How did you have any inspirations for the character of Cassie?
Well, I wanted to create a character that was engaging. I wanted her to be female, and I wanted her to be someone who was intelligent and bright and modern, and surviving in that world, which can be quite a harsh world. She's not sort of fighting battles or anything like that, or saving lives, but it's quite a difficult ladder to climb, the civil service ladder, especially when you get to that sort of Whitehall level, and you have to be quite. She would have to be quite tough to be able to do that. So I wanted to show a modern, intelligent woman in that context, and someone who hadn't had a whole career of success, because one does come across these characters in novels like this, where these are high-flying, bright young Oxbridge graduates who work for the Prime Minister or in Number 10 or whatever. And I didn't want my central character to be one of those. I wanted her to be somebody who basically she was doing procurement projects, in a office. So I wanted to. I guess that the inspiration is all the women who are plugging away in those sort of jobs, doing that sort of work. And it's interesting actually because my publisher was very keen that she should be very good looking and that I should describe what she looked like and her clothes and things, and I pushed back very hard against that, and in fact you will find there is no physical description of Cassie in the book. You know that she's tall, and I guess that's because I am, and if she's going to be seeing Whitehall, then she's going to see it, I suppose, at the level I'm seeing it. If I'm 5'1", you see things a bit differently than if you're sort of 5'10". But apart from the fact that she's tall, that's the only description that you get of her, and that's absolutely deliberate, because that it's much more important to people in those roles in terms of what they do and what they achieve rather than how they look. And I think personally there's far too much emphasis placed on female appearance, well, on appearance generally, on men and women, but I think especially so for women. And it's typical now, even now, that a lot of newspapers will talk about female politicians in terms of how they look rather than what they do. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it really does. You've talked about Plague being a series of 3 books. Do you have an idea of it going beyond 3, or do you think it will have a definite ending in book 3?
Well, I already know what the end of the 3rd one's going to be. So I don't know. There's definitely more. It will depend on the publisher, I guess. It will depend on whether readers want any more. And it'll depend. I think I might have to have a rest from Cassie for a bit, and maybe go back to 13th century Spain. Don't know. That might be a bit too much of a stretch, actually. But I don't know. It'll depend on lots of things. I know that there is the capacity for that. I can see it continuing.
One of my favourite author chat questions when I'm hosting is, would you make a graphic novel of your book?
Now, you told me that you were going to ask me this, for which many thanks. And again, the answer is I don't really know. I love the idea of drawing and of visual media, and in fact, as people who have my book know, and I'll just hold this up. There is a little drawing of Westminster on each of the days that divide the book, because the book is divided into days because there's a ticking clock involved and so on. And I drew that. So I draw, and I like drawing visual images. So on one hand, it would be great. On the other, though, for the reasons I've just explained about not describing Cassie, I sort of don't really want her to be described in that way. I don't want her to be created into a physical character. I want her to remain in readers' minds rather than set out in terms of what she looks like on the page. But I have to say, if DreamWorks contacted me and said, can we make a film? I'd say yes. Chances of that happening are nil, but so I guess, it'll just depend. So
Sam says, was it difficult to vary the pace to build up alongside the ticking clock?
No, I don't think it was that difficult. I mean, ticking clock adds that element of tension and impetus to the story. But I think it was. I don't think that was difficult. I think it was just something that added the immediacy to the events that were happening in the book. And I think ticking always help.
Have you done illustrations for the second book?
Oh, do you? I can. Very strange.
Pardon?
Oh, you're back to normal now.
Wow. Have you done illustrations for the second book as well?
There is only the one in the first one, which is the little drawing of the Palace of Westminster, and there will be one in Oracle of the Temple of Apollo, probably. Though there's one particular image that comes right at the end of the book, which I have not yet done, but I know what it's going to be. So yes, it's just a little signature, I guess. Like having, I've got a number of little homages to various other crime writers. You've probably picked up on them, Caroline. You've read the book, but there's a bit of Sherlock Holmes in there, and there's a bit of Graham Greene, so it, I like doing nice little sort of personal touches, and that will carry over into Oracle. I've already got my Sherlock Holmes reference in there, so.
Is there anywhere else in the world that you've been, or anywhere you'd like to go to set a novel?
Lots of places. Lots and lots of places. I think I would like, I lived in Rome for a number of years when I was growing up, and I would at some point love to set a novel, a crime novel in Rome, have Cassie go to Rome, because it's like London. It's a layered city, literally layered, so that you can walk into some squares in Rome, and the center of the square where they've excavated drops down 20 or 30 feet, because the Roman level was that much lower than the modern city. So you've got these layers of history, rather like London. I think London and Rome, although London is much bigger, have a lot in common in that respect. Also, in that they were both centres of empire and so on. So I think I'd like to take Cassie to Rome at some point. Besides which, I want to go back and see some friends.
So do you want to, we've only got a few minutes left. Do you want to remind everyone about your subterranean event that you're doing?
Thank you. Thank you.
Novel, and you give
yes, I'm doing, if people have found it interesting, the discussion around subterranean London and the history and the River Tyburn and all the other parts of underground London, there is a session. It's free. It's organised by Claret Press, called The Secrets of Subterranean London. It takes place on the 11th of December, and at 7 o'clock on a Friday night. We have Dr. Tom Ardhill, who is a curator of the Museum of London, who curated the Secret Rivers exhibition back in 2019, and Fiona Lucas, who is an award-winning Blue Badge guide, whose speciality is the London Underground, and she's going to be talking about all the hidden ghost stations and ghost lines and so on. And I'll be talking about plague pits and Roman remains and so on. And it's all hosted by Casey Isvester, who is editor-in-chief of Claret Press. So it's free. You can find it on Eventbrite. If you're interested in that sort of thing, do come along and join us. It'll be interactive like this. We'll be live streaming onto Facebook, so people can ask questions and so on. And if you like the sound of Plague and you haven't entered the giveaway, that closes at midnight tomorrow. So just message me on Facebook in the group Facebook page, and I'll put your name into the hat. And thank you very much for having me.
You're more than welcome. Thanks for joining us.